Evening, everyone. Please be seated. Welcome to another Peaceful Solution Character Education Teacher Certification class. I'm glad everybody was able to make it back with us for this chapter. We're continuing in Chapter 5, Maintaining Your Self-Control. And just keep in mind, what we've been covering the last few classes and, what our kind of goal and purpose is and what we're trying to get out of this to relate to the students, to help them to understand that it's great that they learn all of this. It's great that they learn about influences and recognizing the difference between positive influences and negative influences. It's great that they learn what risk-taking behaviors are, that they understand, that there are dangers out there in regards to STDs, unwanted pregnancies, problems consequences that arise from abusing alcohol and drugs. But it's also important that they determine, and this is what we have to impress in their minds, that they determine to consistently practice and uphold these positive moral values, these moral principles that are being presented to them in these classes. Because remember what we covered in character and acceptance, consistency is the key. If a person does something one day and then fails to do it the next day, or because of the influence or pressure or desires from their friends or even their own personal desires, they fail to uphold those positive morals, then they kind of bring themselves down a notch. It's kind of like building up these positive characters, these building blocks to positive character, and then something coming in and knocking out one of the bottom blocks or one of the middle blocks. Well, you got to kind of rebuild that. You kind of start back over, not necessarily from scratch, but you got to kind of rebuild that reputation again because of those poor choices. And so consistency in maintaining these positive character traits are very, very important. Otherwise, the person won't be able to fully realize these positive characteristics when they're faced with having to make a moral choice. Because if they have a mixture of going back and forth, of kind of being wishy-washy in their decision-making process, then it's going to kind of be up for grabs. How they feel about this particular situation as opposed to what they've been taught is the right choice. Okay, and so this is what we want to kind of remind them, because maintenance of something is very important. And then when it comes to character, there can be no slacking in the maintenance schedule. And this is why reading on a daily basis, starting off the class, William gave some of the examples of a teacher who did this several times a week, and the improvements that was seen by other teachers in the children's behavior who were just given this just a little bit, 15 or 20 minutes a few times a week, it makes it makes a difference. But it has to be continually done, otherwise we tend to forget it, right? It's the old adage, if you don't use it, you lose it, right? If you don't use these things, then they kind of start to go into the recesses of your mind. The files get pushed back, and then you have to kind of search for how to respond when something comes up. Kind of like, oh man, I really would have studied for that test now because I'm facing it at this moment. Well, these are real life things that we are preparing the students for. These aren't, fabricated hypotheses that might occur in life. These are things, the examples and the lessons that we're getting them ready for. These are pulled from real life experiences. The statistics of the teenage pregnancies and the abortions and the STDs, those are real things. These are things that society is grappling with on a daily basis. And they're scratching their heads in the medical profession, in the education profession, field of education, in the field of parenting, in the field of law enforcement, when they have to deal with the consequences of these poor choices because people have not been taught the value of self-control. They're kind of scratching their heads and wondering, what can we do now? What can we do to try to fix this? Some people propose, well, let's pass more laws. right? Let's pass more laws and make it stricter. You know, if somebody does this crime, you know, they kind of have the 3 strikes you're out for certain crimes, you know. Well, you know, people whose minds are not focused on abiding by the law don't care about more laws. You know, it's like you know, putting more locks on the door to keep thieves out. You know, thieves look at it as, oh, I accept the challenge. You know, they don't look at it as, oh man, there's more locks, I'm not going to be able to get in there, right? Because their mindset is to not show respect for people and their belongings. And this is where thievery comes in. You know, it's a lack of education and understanding that people have rights, or maybe not understanding, but not caring that people have rights regarding their belongings. Many understand. They recognize when you take something from them that they don't like it, right? And so just reminding us here that you know, part of our purpose and objective is to understand influences and how that influences can affect the child's ability to maintain their self-control, and they're also learning to apply self-control to distinguish between positive and negative influences and not allow others to bring them down to their level. So just a reminder about that, just to always keep that in mind. So we were on page 142 last class, and we're continuing with that. Now, we talked a little bit about, we're in the section entitled Coming Full Circle, and we talked about the consequences that can occur in a person's life if they are pressured or talked into abusing alcohol or drugs, okay? And then these are just a few of the things here that you know, that can affect a young person or an older person. It's not just young people, but we're just dealing with that demographic. But you know, there are a lot of things that can affect them. Like it says here, it puts you, if you allow yourself to be pressured or talked into abusing alcohol or drugs, you put yourself at risk to make poor decisions in many other areas. So it's not just that fact or that scenario, that you know, abuse of alcohol or drugs. That's not just that problem right there that you're having to deal with. It's like we talked about, it affects many other areas. Why? Because when a person abuses, remember the word abuse means the improper use of something. It's just keeping it simple, right? The improper use of something, okay? In this case, alcohol or drugs. When they do these things, it affects their brain. It affects their mind. And like William brought out in the previous class about the different body systems, the different systems of the body. Now, you think of a system, and he gave the example of the 11 systems there. And when you think of a system, it's not just one thing that makes up a system. There's a number of things that make up a system. You don't just have one bone from your head all the way down to your toe to make up your skeletal system, right? Or your nervous system or your cardiovascular system, right? There's many things that play a part, and if one of those things gets thrown out of whack, right, it can affect the entire system itself, but also the other systems that rely on that one system functioning properly. And this is why, you know, it's important to help our students to understand that you're not just, you know, drinking alcohol or abusing drugs and just kind of, you know, just escaping reality. No, there are many consequences that follow, some short term, right? Some can be felt immediately, but some can come way down the line, right? In a person's ability to even just gain and retain new information. And I've talked to people in the past who have, you know, pretty heavily abused their bodies, their minds, with pretty much everything under the sun. You know, they said, listen, if it was out there, I did it. You know, I wanted to go out there and just have the time of my life. But, in their later years, being older men and, in their, 50s and 60s and so forth, they said, I would that I hadn't, because now I'm seeing the problems that arise because of those choices that I make. One of the things is the main thing that I hear is that my memory, my memory is so bad I can hardly remember. By the time I say hi to somebody and I introduce myself 5 minutes later, I don't even remember the person's name anymore, And so you can't really go back and undo what was done in the past. The best you can do is try to make do, or to make the best out of what you have to work with, right? It's like spending all your money. You have $100,000 and you spend all your money. Now you have $5. Now you got to try to make do with the $5 that you have. You can't go back and unspend that money. Okay, well, our minds, they say they had a campaign back in the war on drugs in the 80s and 90s, and they would show the egg, and they show the skillet, and they show the egg being cracked and show that this is your brain on drugs, and the egg sizzling, showing that when you do these drugs, you kind of fry your brain, and they say it was the campaign went, this is your brain, show the eggs, crack the egg in the pot in the skillet, you hear the sizzling, this is your brain on drugs. Any questions? Okay? I mean, it's great as a visual, but it didn't give any incentive to people who were doing drugs, right? Most people would see that and go, man, yeah, I got the munchies anyway. I'm going to go have some eggs, I mean, it didn't teach them. It didn't educate them on anything. Even the Just Say No campaign, it was a great concept, right? It was great in theory. Yes, just say no, because we teach in the Peaceful Solution, say no and mean it. But we also give them everything else that they need to be able to make a sound decision. Why you should say no, what can occur if you don't say no, how to recognize what you should say no to and what you should say yes to, helping them to be able to distinguish and educate themselves so that they can make a sound, educated choice and be confident about it, right? Be confident with the decisions that they make. We want our students to be confident in upholding and standing for moral principles, right? Not like, well, I think I shouldn't smoke marijuana. Not really sure. No, we want them to be confident and say, well, from what I understand and what I've read, marijuana is very harmful to the brain and body. I don't want to have anything that's going to anything to do with something that's going to harm my ability to think, that's going to hinder my ability to make right choices, right? We want them to be confident in that. And as teachers, we have the ability to impart that value of getting the student to value themselves, to have respect for themselves. And the way they do it is through educating themselves or being educated and upholding the moral principles that are taught as they're learning in the Peaceful Solution. So we talked about some of the consequences that come with underage drinking and drug use, and from abusing alcohol and drugs. One of them was drug use in later life, poor grades, loss of friendship, strain on family relationships, premarital sex, unplanned pregnancies, STDs and abortions. I was thinking about the STDs, and we've talked about it before. When these books were written, there were less STDs to worry about. And in the last 20 or so years, we've seen a constant growth and surge of the spreading of STDs, and not only that, but the mutation of existing STDs, because now things are more antibiotic resistant, right? So the thing that they would do in the early 50s, 40s, 50s, 70s, and so forth, they give a person a shot of penicillin or something, and it didn't necessarily get rid of the STD, but it at least hid the symptoms, right? And so it gave a false sense of security that the person can go out and continue to just have fun, right? Spreading the love, right? Spreading the love around, the wealth of microorganisms that break down the body and the mind. But now you have these same bugs, these same microorganisms that have combined and mutated and combined and mutated and combined and mutated over and over again, and they've become not only more resistant to antibiotics, but they've become even more virulent, right? They're become easier to spread. You know, there were certain STDs that were actually mutating with tuberculosis, okay? And tuberculosis is spread through the air, through spittle, through airdrops, and so forth. You know, imagine something like syphilis or chlamydia mixing with tuberculosis, and you have to take a flight somewhere with somebody who has that, and they have a sneeze or a cough or just sitting right next to you talking. You know, you see the potential danger in that? Well, this is what's taking place because, you know, of mankind not being educated in self-control and having this value for themselves, their own bodies, their own minds, and the people that they interact with on a daily basis. Abortions are also a result of these this promiscuity or premarital sex, violence, aggression, crimes leading to arrest, conviction, and prison sentences, and also suicide. Okay, so those are the things that we covered last class in regards to some of the consequences that can occur with underage drinking and drug use. Now we're picking up just a little bit underneath those consequences here, where it says a lack of self-control. And so we have here a lack of self-control in these areas can lead full circle. Full circle. If we have, I meant to bring this out last time for my first slide here. What full circle means from, this is from Merriam-Webster's dictionary there. And it says, through a series of developments that lead back to the original source. Through a series of developments that lead back to the original source. In other words, a lack of self-control in these areas can lead full circle. So lead full circle back to what? Back to the person who made the original decision, the original choice, right? You have heard the statement, that's going to come and kick you in the rear later. You know, that's an example of full circle. You experience the consequences at some point because of your choices. We can't escape those things. Back to the original source, position, or situation, or to a complete reversal of the original position, usually used in the phrase come full circle. And that's what we're talking about here on page 142. These things can lead coming back around full circle and affect you in a negative way. And notice what it says here, and it's a result of a lack of self-control. It can lead full circle to a lack of self-control regarding your emotions. You know, regarding your emotions. And this is something that, you know, we've talked about it a lot in this in this book here, in chapter 2, in chapter 3. You know, emotions are a very, very powerful thing. And we should never teach our students to suppress the emotions, because when they bottle these things up and they don't know how to deal with them, then eventually it's like a tea kettle that, you know, all the steam and pressure is bottled up, it eventually is going to blow at some point in time. No, it's not the suppression. It's the dealing and responding of them with morality. Okay? Your emotions, remember what they're there. They're just kind of there just to tell you what you like and what you don't like, what you agree with and what you don't agree with. It doesn't mean that necessarily there's some immorality taking place. It's just something that you don't agree with. And the goal is to get the students to understand that emotions are not a bad thing, right? But when you experience them as a result of your thoughts, recognize them, and then think back to what you've learned in the peaceful solution as to how to respond. Take note of the emotion. Yeah, it's there. I'm upset, I'm excited, I'm embarrassed, whatever the case might be. But what should supersede the emotion is the moral response. Okay? And this when a person starts to recognize this and do this on their own, they are coming to a stage of maturity. You know, reaching maturity in excellence, and we'll get to that excellence a little bit later there. But if we go back to page 29, page 29 here, because we covered that lesson on not morality, emotions here in this chapter. I just want to rehearse this a little bit here. And this is in the, here we go. On page 29 here of the self-control unit, and this is chapter 2, controlling your emotions to your advantage. And notice the first sentence in the first paragraph. You have the power. You have the power. Every single person has the power to control their thoughts. To control your thoughts. Now we're talking about emotions, but the thought is the preceder of the emotion. Your thoughts and the emotions that arise from the way you perceive a situation. Now, the more a person becomes educated and understands themselves, first and foremost, their triggers and things of that nature, but also how the environment around them functions, right? In comparison to what they've learned in the peaceful solution, their perception of a situation is going to vary. All right. So where a person who might not understood, how to control their emotions, or who might, act impulsively, and someone says something to them that they don't agree with, that they don't like, they might lash out, and yell at the person, or they might even hit the person. But as a person grows in knowledge and understanding, and they understand about themselves and understand about their emotions, and understand that it's important to respond, but to respond in a way that's going to bring forth a peaceful solution, then they're going to see that situation a little bit differently. They're going to be like, well, all right, well, I can understand this person's point of view, right? And their point of view, even though it doesn't agree with mine, is not necessarily wrong. But at this point, we can agree to disagree. You see? So the more educated a person is, the more they value themselves and others, right? Because if you don't value the other person, yeah, you're going to lash out. You're going to say derogatory things to them. You might strike at them or what have you. But when you respect that person or respect yourself, you're going to respond in a respectful way, a way that doesn't bring harm to that person physically or even verbally or emotionally. Emotions are what we feel, and no one feels the same way every day. Look down to the second paragraph there, or third paragraph. However, as important as emotions are, if they are not controlled, notice here, because we're talking about the abuse of alcohol and drugs, right? A lack of self-control in these areas. These areas that we're referring to are the abuse of alcohol and drugs. So if you're not practicing self-control, yes, you're going to abuse alcohol and drugs, and as a result, you're not going to control your emotions. And on page 29, if your emotions are not controlled, they will control you. And this is the very thing that I hear from a lot of young people, not in these classes, but a lot of young people I've heard throughout the times, throughout the years, I don't like being controlled. I don't like people telling me what to do. But then they'll allow their emotions to do that very thing. But they don't see and understand that because they don't see a person, a being. And it sometimes takes a long time for them to see the consequences of those responses. It might not be till later on in life. Sometimes it is 10, 15, 20 years down the road where a young man or woman will come to their teacher or their parent and say, I see what you were trying to do for me. I see what you were trying to tell me. I see now that you were actually looking out for my best interest because you genuinely cared for me and the decisions that I made in life. Thank you. I would have listened to you at that time, but I do see and I understand, and I'm at least going to try to, present these things to my children in the same way. So sometimes it takes a really long time. Emotions that are uncontrolled here can lead to poor choices, which in turn can lead to impulsive behavior like, all right, I'll go ahead and take a hit of that joint, or I'll just, I'll just try one pill, or just one beer, right? It might not even be that hesitant. It might just be in the spur of the moment. You know what? I'm just gonna just wow out tonight. I'm just gonna have a great time. I'm with my friends, with my buddy old pals, having a great time. The weather's nice. We're out by the beach or whatever the case is. I'm gonna drink a 6-pack tonight. All right? Those are impulsive choices, impulsive behavior that you might regret. All right? And as we get further into this and get into building moral excellence, there's a section in there where we talk about drinking and the dangerous rite of passage, right? And the consequences that come. And as was brought out in the previous classes, some of these people who have become so intoxicated, they've actually died as a result of alcohol poisoning and aspirating on their own, choking on their own vomit because their reflexes aren't able to kick in and save the person's life, to make them aware that they're in a dangerous situation. Their body, their systems are so malfunctioning and so delayed that they end up dying as a result. I think I have a slide on this one for emotions. So just keep in mind here for your notes, emotions are either positive or negative, triggered by our experiences and thoughts, tell us what we like and what we don't like, but notice here are not an excuse to show disrespect to ourselves or others, such as in the case of abusing alcohol and drugs. Now, what they can do to us is they have the capacity to affect you both mentally and physically. Physically, emotions can cause us to experience intense reactions in our bodies. Mentally, emotions can cause us to feel energized or worn out, satisfied or discouraged, motivated or depressed. And when not managed, can result in serious physical and mental illness. So just keep those things in mind because, the goal is not to suppress or get rid of emotions, just to help the young men, the young women, the students to manage them, right? Remember, when they're not managed correctly, then they can lead to other serious consequences, both mentally and physically. So these things can lead full circle to a lack of self-control regarding your emotions. Also, how you interact. Emotions and how you interact. Let's see, there was one spot there. We covered enough on that. How you interact. Let's look back to page 89. How you interact. Because we talked about these interactions in the 4th chapter on applying self-control to interactions and communication. All right? And so when a person is intoxicated, right? When they are not in control of their thoughts, their feelings, and in many cases their actions. You get somebody who is what they call blackout drunk, and they go off on a tangent, just doing all types of crazy things, and eventually they pass out. And the next morning, people are telling them everything that they did, or even showing them nowadays videos of the things they did. They're like, man, I don't remember doing any of that. I don't remember doing any of that. Remember what we talked about in the previous class in regards to violence and aggression as one of the consequences of abusing alcohol and drugs. And the study showed that if a person has a tendency towards to respond with aggression, if they have a tendency to respond violently or with anger, when they are intoxicated, and this was directly referring to alcohol, when they're intoxicated with alcohol or drunk, that inhibition that would somewhat have kept that anger in check is gone. So, they lash out, they get aggressive, they get in fights. You heard of what they call bar fights. People go to these bars to drown out their sorrows, right? And they're angry because of the way their boss treated them and so forth. I know that there's what they call social drinking and things of that nature. But a lot of times people are sitting there at the bar and they're dealing with stress and anger and depression and anxiety. What occurs when you have a group of people who have that same mindset and now they're intoxicated, right? Well, you don't have that ability to restrain your thoughts, restrain your emotions, and restrain your actions. Now those those emotions, those thoughts are going to control you, and you're going to do what you have the normal tendency to do, and that's lash out with violence, aggression, retaliation, and so forth. So back on page 89 here, it says, in regards to communication and interaction and self-control, it says, by using both language and behavior, we share our feelings, needs, and wants with others, and they in turn share theirs with us. Now, this is in a, let's just say a non-intoxicated scenario where people are just, normally going about their day, going about their lives, and interacting. And look at the second paragraph there. It says, ironically, the way in which we communicate often leads to misunderstandings, hurt feelings, and conflicts. Looked at the last paragraph in that same last sentence, in that same paragraph. It says we should make it our goal to always communicate and interact in a way that is respectful, considerate, and compassionate. Well, all goals get cast to the wind when a person is high on drugs, or drunk off of alcohol. They're not thinking about their goals. They're not thinking about the feelings of the other person that they're interacting with. Notice in the last paragraph there, first two sentences, it says, an important part of developing a positive moral character is learning how to communicate with self-control. This is all the time, right? Not just when you feel like it, not just when you're interacting with somebody who you like, but all the time, including when you interact with somebody who might push your buttons, who might step on your toes, who might rub you the wrong way, a person who might deliberately abuse and bully you. Remember, emotions are not an excuse to show disrespect to yourself or to someone else. When we interact without self-control, feelings get hurt. People get hurt. People are misunderstood and conflicts arise. All right? Well, let's go back there to that, let's see here. Now let's go back there to page 142. So a lack of self-control in these areas can lead full circle to a lack of self-control regarding your emotions, how you interact, and also a loss of self-respect. I have my, let's see here. I have my acceptance unit here, and you can write this down for your notes because I don't expect that you have your book with you, but if you do, that's great. You can turn to page 133 because we're going to look at some of these things that lead to self-respect, a loss of self-respect, and what you need to recognize in order to keep yourself from losing self-respect. And it's what we covered in the previous lessons here, being mindful and aware, being able to distinguish between positive and negative influences and the peer pressure and so forth. If we look back to page 133 in the acceptance unit, or you can write down for your notes there, because we're talking about the very same thing here that we're covering on page 142 in the self-control unit, under knowing the difference, right? Knowing the difference. Know the difference. It says, have you ever heard of the age of accountability? This simply means that although you are not yet an adult, you have arrived at an age where you are responsible for what you think, say, and do, even under the influence of drugs or alcohol. I don't think anybody's ever got off in the courtroom of a crime because they were under the influence, they abused drugs or alcohol, as their defense. Well, Your Honor, I was high on cocaine, and that's why I drove 70 miles an hour through that school zone and hit all those people. Oh, so you really weren't accountable for your actions. Okay, well, case dismissed. Said no judge ever, right? You are responsible. That person was responsible when they had the thought in their mind to put that drug into their system, into their body. Okay? Now, even with that thought, all the way up to the point where they put it in their body, however it entered into their body, they had the opportunity to make the choice to stop it. okay? You can't regret. There's never a regret that has ever been formed when a person stops the process of engaging in a negative moral choice and decides to uphold morality. There are no regrets in upholding morality, okay? But many, many regrets for engaging in immorality. Notice here under negative influences here, oh wait, no, let's back up here. Knowing the difference between positive and negative influences can help you to make choices that you will not regret, all right? If you make a poor choice because of how you allow yourself to be influenced, and that's what we talked about here under coming full circle, if you allow yourself to be pressured or talked, influenced, if you allow yourself to be influenced and choose not to follow the values you've learned from the Peaceful Solution Character Education Program, you will have no one to blame but yourself, because you are at the age of accountability. And then under those negative influence there, the negative influences, we see the first example there. It says, and what negative influences do? They encourage dishonest, immoral choices that can sway you or compromise your self-respect. That can sway you or compromise your self-respect. The respect that you should have for yourself. You should have care, consideration, and concern. You should have regard and value for your well-being, for what your potential can become. You know, for what your mind is capable of doing and bringing you to with the proper education, the proper environment, and so forth, the proper guidance. But when you don't have that value, that care for yourself, then you will engage into activities such as premarital sex, underage drinking, and illegal drug use. They can also encourage violence, aggression, as well as criminal activities. The very same thing, the very same consequences that we covered on page 142 in the self-control unit. So you see here, all these things, they tie together. There's an iteration and reiteration. It's like building a continual sandwich with 5 layers, so to speak, in these 5 books here. And that sandwich is going to lead to a very sought after character that society greatly desires to see, that employers greatly desire to have. Employers want someone who exhibits moral excellence in their interactions, in their behavior, you know, with other people. That is exactly what they want. Everybody wants someone to practice that with them. Even if they might be a little bit lacking on it in their interactions with other people, they want someone to be honest with them. They want someone to be respectful with them. They want someone to not lash out at them, right? Everybody wants these things. They want these character traits to be displayed in society towards themselves. Now, the goal is to get everybody to not only just want that and respect and value that, but respect and value that enough that they will display and practice these things, learn them, and practice these things in their interactions with everybody and in every situation. Let's see here. So let's get back here to 142 here. So it can cause a lack of self-control regarding your emotions, how you interact, and a loss of self-respect. So it's up to you to educate yourself on how drugs and alcohol can affect your body. Now pay really close attention to this, because if a person's not really listening and not really paying attention, you know, and there's nothing wrong with the way that this is written by any means, but you know, in teaching this to our students, we need to emphasize certain points so that they don't go off thinking that, oh, well, this means that I need to just educate myself about X, Y, and Z. And I don't want to give any spoiler alerts, that's why I didn't give all the details. But it says here, gather all the facts. Gather all the facts. The very first thing we tell everyone to do. Gather the facts and make sure they're correct. The true facts. This means it's not coming from your peers. You know, man, I heard, you know, ketamine, or, you know, what are these, K2 and spice and All these other, there's a lot of different things that a lot of young people are using today. I don't keep up with all of them. Marijuana, I heard that's kind of bad for you. Ah, man, nah, come on. I've done that thing hundreds of times. It ain't really that bad. In fact, it's so good you'll want to do it twice, right? That's not the place you want to get your source of information from, right? You want to go to reliable sources that aren't giving you information based on feelings, right? You want information based on, you want unbiased, what they call unbiased information, right? Somebody who's not standing to profit from you using their product, okay? Or not using this one, but using this one, right? You want information that's going to help you to make an educated choice. And sometimes you might have to go to several sources to make sure that those facts are substantiated by several different witnesses. But gather all the facts so you can make a wise decision to, notice, avoid using any substance that could affect your brain, altering the way you think. That pretty much puts all the abuse of any drugs and the abuse of any alcohol into one big bucket, all right? Especially illegal drugs. Okay, now, again, if a person is prescribed something by their healthcare professional, as I mentioned in the previous class, there are directions on that bottle to use as directed, okay? And when a person goes outside of that direction, that's where the abuse occurs because it's being used improperly. So gather the facts so that you can make a wise decision to avoid using any substance that could affect your brain, altering the way you think. Not gather the facts to determine which is the best and safest drug to use. This is what I want to make the point of, to put that in the mind of the student, because sometimes people have the thought in their mind, well, marijuana is not as bad as cocaine. Or, heroin is not as bad as crack. Or drinking this beer is not as bad as drinking, getting drunk off of this is not as bad as getting drunk off of liquor, or whatever the case might be. They kind of pick the lesser of two evils, so to speak, right? We want them to know, to be able to make a wise decision to avoid, to completely avoid. I have a slide for that word avoid there, to avoid. And it's a transitive verb, and it means to keep away from. Notice, to shun. To shun. Has anybody ever been shunned before by their peers or, somebody else? I'm sure we have at some point, whether it was a sibling or whatever. Get out of here. We're playing or we're having a great time, or whatever. But to shun, to prevent the occurrence or effectiveness of, the effectiveness or the effect of drugs or alcohol on your body, on your brain, right? You prevent it because you avoid it altogether. To refrain from. Now, also that word shun in the next slide there, it's to avoid deliberately and especially habitually. Especially habitually. Why habitually? Because maintaining your positive character has to be consistently done. Something that is habitual is something that is done over and over and over and over. You've heard of a habitual drug user, a habitual liar, a habitual thief. What about a habitual peacekeeper? Somebody who is habitually honest, somebody who habitually makes great choices, who consistently makes moral choices. All right. Well, when you shun these negative influences, which drugs and alcohol, illegal drugs or abuse of drugs and alcohol bring about influences. They influence your brain, your mind, into making wrong choices. That's why it's called under the influence. So we want them to be able to make wise decisions and avoid substances that could affect their brain and alter the way they think. Look at the bottom there. It says, warning, warning, warning. Some drugs can cause your eyes to get glassy and bloodshot. Now, the next slide there kind of shows you what those glassy eyes look like. Now, granted, people have allergies too. I'm not saying the next time you see somebody, you think that they're smoking some dope or something like that. But this is these are some of the telltale signs that can occur when somebody is abusing drugs, right? When they're high on marijuana or whatever the case might be, even alcohol, their eyes get glassy and they're bloodshot and so forth. They get glassy and bloodshot. They can cause your heart to race and give you diarrhea. Let's show the next slide on that. No, I'm just showing. I don't have a slide for diarrhea. I avoided that slide, right? Practice self-control. But those are some of the things that can occur. Now, you think about people who get into situations where they become so heavily intoxicated and they suffer something like, bowel incontinence, diarrhea, coupled with this heat, right? They can go into severe dehydration and even suffer as a result of a heat exhaustion or heat stroke because they don't have enough liquid in their body to regulate their internal core temperature. And many people have, passed out and died being intoxicated in extremely hot weather because, contrary to popular belief, a cold beer on a hot day does not hydrate you like water does, or Gatorade or something with electrolytes in it. And we're not endorsing Gatorade, but anything with electrolytes in it, right? But that's the influence. The influence can cause you to not have the respect for yourself when you're under the influence of those drugs, that alcohol, to care about your environment and how you interact with your environment. It's the same thing with being cold. Sometimes alcohol can cause you to get flushed and to be really hot, right? And then you think that you're hot. I see this a lot. I'm originally from Cleveland, and we got the old Browns fans up there. They'll be out in the stadium when the snow's falling and it's 20 degrees, and they're holding up their big signs with their shirts off, and they're sloshing their beer around and everything like that. And somebody's going to get frostbite somewhere if they don't put those shirts back on. But they feel great. They feel warm. It's 20 degrees outside. But they're having a good time with their friends. And people make very poor choices, and they suffer as a result of those things. Not to mention the embarrassment of seeing those beer bellies. All right, let's look at page 143 here. It says, think about it. Students who admit to drinking and drug use said they mainly did so because their friends did, and they didn't want to be different or feel left out. All right, and we talked about that there in the acceptance unit. We talked about that in this unit too. We read several of the reasons as to why, but just going back to the acceptance unit on page 67, under Who Me Conform, and that's in chapter 4, page 67 in the acceptance unit, for your notes. The very last paragraph under Who Me Conform, it says, one of the most common forms of conformity is called peer pressure. Peer pressure is when you feel like you must behave in a certain way in order for your friends to respect you and see you as an equal. All right, now the definition of respect is definitely misconstrued because a true friend would not influence you to do something that could bring harm to yourself. Okay, peer pressure can either be positive or negative, and then so there we see in that page also positive conformity and when to conform to something that is positive and morally positive and beneficial. Let's look over here to page 143. Page 143 here. And we are still in procedure 8, just for your notes. Let me just double check that because it goes to page 144 there. Procedure 8, 144, be your own person. The next procedure will start on 145 there. But notice here it says, the title of this section is called Be Your Own Person. And it says, isn't it ironic that both positive and negative influences can come from the same source? For example, there are many violent and sexually explicit shows on TV, but there are some that are educational. The TV can be a great source of information about events that can affect the ability or the stability and peace of our world. Okay, so they can be a source of negative influences if you allow yourself to, if you subject yourself It's kind of like when you think about that word subject, and you think about it in the terms of like a king. You know, a king has subjects, people that serve him, or a queen. You know, though they have servants. Well, when you subject yourself to these influences over a period of time, you eventually become a servant to them. You become a slave to those influences, right? And the things that they tell you to do, not that they're telling you to do it, but they're influencing your mind. They're putting these things are being driven into your subconscious mind and your conscious mind. Your conscious mind is accepting them, and they're looking at these things and they're getting excited when you see a high-speed car chase, or somebody having a shootout with law enforcement, or you know, somebody getting into a fight with somebody else. You know, you get excited, your heart races, and you're not in the fight. You know, you're not in the high-speed car chase, but your subconscious mind can't tell the difference between what it's seeing on that television and what you're actually doing. It just sees it all the same. It's like your subconscious mind is constantly watching something play on the television screen, so to speak, right? And so when you subject yourself to those things, you eventually become a slave to them. And that's how you're going to respond, because that's what you're being educated. That's what a person is being taught to use as a response. Anger, violence, you know, being the smart guy all the time, you know, being disrespectful in their responses to authorities and so forth. But at the same time, it can be a source of positive influences too. You know, television, the internet, you know, phones and things like that, they're merely tools, right? That's how they should be looked at. They're tools that should be used to better yourself, you know, or used to aid you in bettering other people as well. If you use them improperly, if you abuse the internet, yes, you can actually abuse the internet. If you abuse the use of your cell phone, if you abuse the use of a television, it can bring about negative consequences. The same holds true for your peers, that both positive and negative influences can come from the same source. Peers can be both positive and negative influences. The key now, notice here, to developing self-control is to resist negative peer pressure. I'm sorry, let me read that again. The key to developing self-control to resist negative peer pressure is to learn how to be your own person. How to be your own person. Now, this doesn't mean that, you know, you isolate yourself from everybody else. You know, they say no man's an island, or no person's an island, right? We need to interact with people to enjoy life, right? We're codependent. We are interdependent for our resources in life, right? Even if you leave society, you have to take something with society in order for you to survive. And so it's not meaning isolate yourself, so to speak, from those around you, but this being your own person it first starts internally. And we talked about that in the acceptance unit, in understanding purposes and goals. And we won't get to it today, but you can write down for your notes pages 131, 146, lesson plan 6C, and page 110 in the acceptance unit, in understanding how to learn to be your own person. Because those lessons show the importance of understanding our purpose and setting goals to achieve our purpose. Having a goal in life. Remember, if you don't have a goal in life, it's like running a race without a finish line. A person who doesn't have any goals for themselves, who doesn't have any respect for themselves, they can be so easily influenced into engaging into any type of risk-taking behavior, not even considering how that will affect their future. And then later on, when they think about things that they want to do, and they've maybe been involved in the system now where they have a record, now some things are kind of possibly shut out for them, because a lot of places of employment, they won't give jobs to people who've done certain things in their past, because there's a level of kind of trust or risk that they feel that they will be taking on. Again, you can't go back and undo those things. You can just make the best of what you have after you learn it, after you realize it. So those things will help you to learn how to be your own person and really how to be a moral person, a person who is able to make wise, sound decisions that benefit themselves and others, both currently and in the future. Remember, those things come back around full circle. So what do you want to come back to you? Think about your decisions as an investment into your future, and plant that in the minds of your students. Your decisions now are seeds that you're planting in the soil of your future. And they're going to bring forth some type of fruit for you. Either it's going to be a prickly pear or, some type of, we have sandburrs here in Texas. And if you get one of them fresh green things in your foot, boy, oh man, boy, you know it right away. Especially when they hook in there and they don't want to come out easily, right? And you got to hook one end to a truck and then the other end to the sandbar and then just close your eyes and have somebody step on the gas. They can be pretty painful, right? Or do you want it to bring back something that's going to bring, symbolically speaking, a beneficial fruit, something that you can enjoy, something that you think about a seed. You take a seed from an apple or an orange or whatever your most preferred fruit is or vegetable, and you take that one seed and you plant it in the earth. And everything goes well, that seed eventually will bring forth a little plant, which will grow into a little sapling, which will grow into a tree that eventually will sprout and grow many, many apples that also have many, many seeds that you can take and plant many, many more trees. Now that's something that's very beneficial. The same thing can occur with negative choices. And you can spring up a lot of many negative consequences that come bombarding you later on life, and you're like, where in the world did all these come from? It came back full circle. So think about the things that you do, your decisions you make now, because everything has a consequence. Every cause yields an effect. Ask yourself what you stand for. What are your values, and what is the top priority in your life? And this is the time period where a lot of young people need to be thinking about these things. They're not thinking about it when they're, a toddler or 5 or 6 years old and things of that nature, but they're getting to the point where they're getting ready to transition, coming out of junior high, going into high school, and they're starting to think about, career choices and what they want to do later on in life, what types of, how do they want to contribute to society and so forth. Well, if they don't understand what they stand for, then they can be led off course very easily by quote-unquote friends who have their best interest in mind or who just want them to enjoy life. Live a little, they say. Live a little. Have fun while you can. You got plenty of time to go to school. You got plenty of time to get an education, right? But what occurs when that time you tuck away from getting education, you spent abusing alcohol and drugs, now you can't retain the knowledge that will enable you to become a better person. You can't go back and get that. You can't go and get that back. So it's important to, we'll leave off here on this second paragraph here under Be Your Own Purpose, but getting the students to ask themselves, what is it that they stand for? If they don't know what they stand for as a teacher, we should help give them guidance and direction, right? And that's what a true friend does. They encourage and motivate them towards the achieving of positive goals. And the teacher should be a friend to their student. But to help them to see what they could stand for, to help them to understand the potential that they have to be the best person that they can be. What are your values and what is the top priority in life? And that's a question that only they can answer, right? But as a teacher, in listening to those questions, those answers, we can kind of gently guide them on the path, if their answers are off course, on the path to using morality, using the principles that are found in the peaceful solution to achieve those goals, right? If they're positive goals, right? Not I want to be the #1 kingpin, drug lord. No, you can't use the peaceful solution to do that. But you can use the peaceful solution to take those maybe marketing skills or selling skills to go into a field to sell or market things that would be beneficial to other people, right? Like positive moral education. Not that you have to sell it, but showing people the benefit of it. So we're going to stop right there on page 144, second paragraph, and be your own person. We'll pick up next class with David as our next teacher, and our next class is going to be Wednesday, July 20th at 5:30 Central Standard Time. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at the next class. Have a wonderful evening.